Welcome to Hotfix. I'm Christoph, here with my co-host Stefan. Our guest today is Nils Stotz. Nils is a true thought leader in the product space. He has led product teams in various companies and was in the founding team of 2 startups, one of which was part of the Y Combinator batch in summer 2019. Nils is head of product at Content Food today, a German unicorn. He also is a successful author. He has mentored over 20 product managers and has done over 300 experiments. Today, we will talk about the 3 types of failures, which is basic, complex, and intelligent. We'll talk about experimentation. And lastly, we will talk about how to not annoy your boss. Welcome to the show, Nils. It's an honor to have you here as our first guest.
Thanks a lot. Super honored to be here. This sounds like such a success story.
Well, it is.
I do think so too. I think you have quite an impressive career to look at over the last couple of years. What I thought especially interesting about what Christoph said is the 300 experiments he mentioned. And I think looking at your LinkedIn page, you also talk a lot about experimentation. So I would really like to understand why this is so close to your heart. Why is this such an important topic for you?
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of aspects, right? So actually there's a nice anecdote that I can tell you about. So last week I was also in Boston and I met with Stefan, who's the author of Experimentation Works. And he's also a Harvard professor. So it was crazy to be invited there. And I also talked with him about, that the business world and leadership and all this just changed, right? Like opinion and like observational data and things like this are of course still there, but especially when it comes to software and, software businesses, we just have better methods. And one of these methods is experimentation. It's just like known that this is sort of the gold standard for decision making. I mean, the only thing that is even more accurate or better is, like reviews and things like this or systematic reviews. And this is just a method that I would like to evangelize, right? But my particular angle also on this is, of course, we can say, hey, this is the thing that we all need to do all the time. But my angle is also to get it into the mind of leaders to hook it into something. And this is also what Professor Tomke said, like you need to find a problem or something that affects every leader. And what he chose, for example, is innovation. So when I approach someone from a mature business and say, hey, you need to innovate, of course, this resonates with them. And then they ask like, how? And then, of course, then you approach them with experimentation. This is also sort of like how I structure my posts, that I want to make sure that, it's not only about which statistical concepts to use, which processes to do and stuff like this, but also like sort of the story that you tell, why we need to do this. And yeah, this is why I'm so kind of passionate about the topic. Yeah.
So you talk a lot about experimentation, you write a lot about experimentation. How much do you then actually experiment when, for example, posting? So how much did you experiment with which type of post works best? Or like all these types of things that you could apply to the medium you're using to actually evangelize it. Are you doing that quite a lot or not?
You mean in the LinkedIn posts?
For example, or like when you co-author blog posts or things like this, like how much do you experiment with content that you create?
Yeah, I talked about this with so many people. Like it's just so hard to do it with LinkedIn, really. I mean, I'm kind of trying to do it, because I'm trying all sorts of different things. But the problem is obviously that you just have so many variables, like you, for example, I don't know, the time of the day, the sort of like people that recently connected with you, but also just the algorithm that no one really 100% understands, right? And like what I decided for myself to do is, for the rest of the year, just post more or less intuitively, like what comes to my mind or what resonates with me at this point. And at the end of the year, I kind of try to analyze, like, I don't know, sit down and really analyze, okay, which post worked and try to figure out like, okay, why did this work? And I already connected with a bunch of other creators. And we said this, we said like, okay, during the time when it all slows down a bit at the end of December, we'll sit together and try to sort of like discuss this and try to see if we can, resonate why this is. Because for some posts, I understand why people liked it and why people follow me or why people approach me. But for others, I have no idea why this was good or bad. So this is kind of the way how I currently approach it. And then maybe next year, if I find a certain pattern.
And Nils, you mainly worked for B2B companies. I think, especially in the B2B world, experimentation is not a topic that has landed in all companies. I think it's mainly because of the fact that building features might be generally more complex, and then experimentation, especially UI experimentation, sometimes doesn't fit into the timeline. Do you have any opinion? So how do you best approach experimentation in B2B companies?
Yeah. So first of all, my definition of experimentation is broad. Experimentation doesn't necessarily mean you need to run an A/B test. It just means, for example, that you try to collect evidence for the decision that you're making, essentially. So this is a very broad definition. If you say this, then you have a lot of different options. Then you can still say, hey, I do interviews, or I use tools or websites like usertesting.com and things like this. And with this, you can also try to gather additional evidence. One concept that I always also mention in this context is like this thing by Itama Gilad, this confidence meter, which sort of tries to also systemize like, okay, what is this piece of evidence worth? And then sort of like be able to compare different features against each other. And of course, in the B2B space, this is more difficult, mainly related to the complexity of the product, first of all. So, I mean, I can tell you, for example, in Contentful, we have single users, we have companies on top of them, and we have like different tiers and different versions. So this becomes very difficult to experiment in every aspect. But you have your spots where you can experiment. You have, for example, the activation funnel where a lot of traffic is happening, and also some other pages where you can experiment a lot. The challenge then as a growth person or growth leader is then really to also make sure that everyone understands that this still cost impact, right? Because if I say, okay, I lifted the onboarding or activation rate by 20%, great. But what does this mean ideally in dollars, just to also be able to tell a story around this, right?
Yeah, amazing. I love this definition of yours.
And one particular thing that I've always struggled with, so I've always very heavily pushed for hypothesis-driven work, experimentation within my teams. And one thing that I have seen so many times now is that some teams particularly, they result in like a decision fatigue. At one point, they want to experiment about everything. And now suddenly they don't want to take decisions anymore, but they rather want to run another experiment and another experiment. And then sometimes I've been in situations where PMs in my team were like running experiments for things that were... So the question is, can you do too much of it? Or do you think or how do teams best decide when to stop experimenting and when should they take a decision?
Yeah, that is one of the harder questions, to be honest. I was in the exact same situation. And, especially as someone who always tries to promote experimentation, I, of course, want to say, of course, keep doing it, and you don't want to stop them. But at the same time, you also want to say, hey, maybe it doesn't matter if it's that shade of red or a lighter shade, and if this gives 2% lift, because, we also have limited traffic and things like this. It's really hard, and I think it ultimately depends a bit on the situation and also what I always say on the momentum of experimentation in the organization, because unfortunately it's not something that we can evaluate very data driven, but it's just a feeling that you see like, okay, now we have the momentum and the support to do a lot of experimentation. Then I would just say, go for it. Also go for the smaller ones. Or you see that people want to see also a bit of results, or let's say less optimization and more innovation. So to really figure out new stuff. And ultimately what helped me in this regard is also to sort of define a portfolio of these experiments with my teams, right? So I think you can always try to, ultimately when you run an experiment, everyone tells you to document a lot, which is right. But if you just add an additional section and saying, okay, where would you see this on a scale between here is absolute optimization and here is full innovation? And then you create sort of a ritual and say, okay, at the end of the month, we always look in which area we are currently, and if this is something that feels right for us or where we need to shift this small bets versus big swings, this is something that comes up all the time. And I think it's super hard to measure, but in my opinion, this is like one of the best things to evaluate this at least a bit.
I really love the tip because I think it's great, and I will definitely apply that with my teams because I think it's like this. In the end, it just gives you this understanding, right? You have 10 things. These 6 things are more geared towards innovation, and these 4 things are more geared towards optimization. And very simply, you understand what am I doing with all these experiments that we are running across all these teams right now. So I think it's amazing. Cool. Exactly, I think this is a great transition from experimentation to the next part of the podcast, the failure story, because I would like to now spend a bit of time on your failure story. And this is open for you. And from here on, I would just give you the word and take us through your failure story.
Yeah. I am also a big promoter of a failure culture at every company I was at. And I think one of the most important concepts that I usually introduce is this sort of different types of failures. So this I didn't invent this. This was invented by Amy Edmondson in the book, The Right Kind of Wrong. And she's the author that basically also created the concept or coined the term of psychological safety. This goes in the same direction because she differentiates between a basic failure, a complex failure, and an intelligent failure. And when I'm, this is also like a common question in interviews, like tell me about a time when you failed, right? And I think it's always very nice also for people who get in interviews to differentiate between those 3 things. Because to tell you, I can tell you a couple of stories for each of those, but maybe we dive into the basic failure first and start with the definition. And the definition is basic failure is just an oversight, a slip, right? Just something that happens because you didn't pay attention to something. And there were so many failures like this that happened in my career that I probably can't count them. But just to give you one example, there was a feature that we rolled out at an insurtech company where we essentially gave the user more options to regulate their coverage within the mobile app. In the situation of the insurance partnership and stuff like this, you also depend on other people. So it's not like you can decide everything. So you depend on also your insurance partners. That means that creates a lot of pressure and a deadline and things like this. So what we did, we created all the tickets, and in the end we released it. We needed to release it at a certain point in time. And then we're trying to see, okay, what are the results? And then we couldn't see the results because we forgot the tracking. And this is a basic failure, right? Everyone knows this is something I don't even know who would be responsible. Maybe me, maybe the engineering manager, maybe all of us. But it's just something that's very avoidable, right? And for things like this happen all the time. And then we try to analyze it, of course, and say okay, why did this happen? There was pressure, there was a time someone was sick, whatever. The thing that you do against these kind of failures is to work with rituals and to work with checklists, in my opinion. And you also have to sort of have, I think, in total 3 different ingredients actually for this. First of all, if you release something, because this is a situation that happens all the time. You release features all the time. And then you need to create a technical possibility to just press a button. So a feature toggle or feature flagging. And second, you need a sort of a ritual where you say, okay, we all come together and do this. And third, you need this sort of process, which is a checklist. In the checklist, you just put all the things that you encountered throughout your career, right? Did we do the copy in German and in English? Did we consider brand? Did we inform customer service about it? Did we implement the tracking? And you go through this together with a team. This is also what Amy Edmondson described in her book, right? Because for high security and high risk jobs like surgeons or pilots, this is what they do, right? Because those are extremely smart people, but still those basic things they keep forgetting. And also maybe to enrich this with another anecdote, right? When I was still at a business school and doing an internship in investment banking, investment banking is not very, I don't want to hate on investment banking, but essentially you create PowerPoint slides a lot. That's just what happens, right? And I was there as an intern, and there was another analyst who worked a lot with me. And he, of course, had more experience. And this guy was a guy with a physics PhD and like extremely crazy smart. And he was basically also sitting there and doing PowerPoint slide. You create the stuff, you show it to the partner, he goes back and be like, oh, the font is wrong, blah, blah, blah. Of course, he's super smart, but this is such a repetitive task that happens all the time that you need to find measures for yourself to prevent errors. And a checklist, always before a certain event happens, is the perfect thing to do. So every time before he approaches the partner, he just, goes through the checklist, right font, right bullet points, action title, blah, 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 things like this. And yeah, this worked also pretty well for him. And I think this also works pretty well for releasing features. So yeah, this was what I think about the basic failures, which is the first category. Yeah.
What's the second category?
Should we dive into the second one? Yeah. The second one is not so easy because this is a complex failure. And a complex failure is something that I would say is, hard to predict and also very hard to prevent. And my example for this is, especially when different teams work together. So I had often the situation that I worked because I'm usually working in growth. And when you work in growth, you often work on activation and onboarding. And when you work in this area, you need to work cross-functionally, right? You can't just say I'm the product manager and I, work on the product. You need to work with marketing and you need to understand how the entire funnel works, from how you attract the customer until the customer actually forms a habit within your product, right? And what I experienced there is if the activation metrics defined, so we differentiated between setup metric, aha metric, and habit metric. And, we gave the marketing team the setup metric. So saying, okay, it's very easy to get people into the product and let them experience the product. And we as a product team took on the aha metric. And what you do when you create a situation like this is the marketing team is very much focused on short-term gains, trying to get the cheapest customer in your product. And you as a product team are rather focused on the long term. So you're trying to use these customers that came for a certain thing or a certain expectation and try to engage them and keep them in the product. But this often does not really work, right? Because it's just incentivized in a wrong way. And, the customer often comes into the product with the completely wrong expectations. And the funny thing was also that this was something that took so long to realize because we understood that this is a cross-functional initiative. And we had the meetings on a weekly basis where we just talked different languages because we both optimize for different KPIs. And only when we realized this, when we said hey, what about we both own the same metric, which is the aha metric, which is rather the long-term metric, we know that, only together we can influence them and no one has full control over them. But only then the right discussions are created. Only then we looked at what is the segment, how do we engage this specific segment. And this is what ultimately solved this sort of failure because it was just so convoluted within different systems, right? I think there are many examples like this where you can't even say in advance that this happens. But I guess the right thing to do in this sort of context is always to question yourself and always to ask yourself in a retro style, like, hey, why are we in this situation? Why is this not working? And be honest and also be willing to sort of step outside of your comfort zone, because obviously for marketing, this is then also not so easy to say we also own the aha metric. I mean, why should they do, right? Because this is usually product territory. This is just something that sometimes you need to do, yeah.
And
so this was the
I have a specific question. So, because I would assume that in this situation, still marketing would have had some kind of measurement if they brought X amount of leads for sales. I would have imagined sales would have pressured for them to help them in the short term, to bring them good leads that they can work on, and so on and so forth. So how do you balance something like this? I think there's usually, I would say, there is this discrepancy where sales would almost always be incentivized very short term, closing immediately, and then product very long term. And then you have something like marketing or growth that is somewhere in between. How do you balance this? How do you get everyone on the same page to work towards the same goals?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on how you structure the whole initiative. First of all, it needs to be an open conversation for everyone, right? I also talked about this with Stefanie Lawyer, who's an amazing product leader. She said there's no such thing as product strategy. There's a strategy. We all follow the same strategy. Before starting an initiative like this, which requires a lot of collaboration, we need to make sure that everyone is already feels heard already. Yeah. And when you achieve this, then I think the solution can be for sure creating the right metric, creating the right KPI. A judge told me this once, like the best verdicts are always when no one feels satisfied. And I think it's the same for this metric, so that everyone feels a bit uncomfortable with the metric. But ultimately, you know, as a team, you say like, we work on this now together. And also then on top of this, of course, create the rituals and the meetings for this. And also make sure that the right people are in these meetings, right? So that you can have an open discussion that no one wants to show off, but we really trying to solve this problem and trying to solve this for this KPI. And I think this would be the recipe, in my opinion, to sort of like balance this conflict. Yeah.
Amazing. I think that's a very common challenge to align across beyond functional teams and align them around a specific incentive. So let's get to the third kind of failure.
Yeah, the third failure, that's my favorite failure. It's called an intelligent failure. And when we say intelligent failure, right, then we essentially mean experimentation. So we create something or we release something in order to learn about the customer, about the business, about the market situation. And just no matter if the experiment is successful or if it fails, we learn about it. There are tons of failure in this context. My favorite example is always when I was working at a mental health startup. And, you know, this was about group therapy. We had group therapy online and we had these sessions together with a mentor. Since we had a small user base back then, it was a very early stage product. We essentially went to all of these customers and asked them like, okay, if you would have a magic wand, what would you additionally like in our product? I think 90% of them said we would like to have single sessions, not only group sessions, but on top of that, single sessions, right? Mm-hmm. And now you can say 90% of the user base says this, let's try to implement this. But of course, this would be a high risk decision because this would mean you need to hire more mentors, most likely. You need to change the payment situation. You need to implement a whole new sort of platform onto your product. Just a lot of implementations that create a lot of additional effort and which is also maybe not so good for your business model after all, right? So very problematic decision. So what we did then is, as I said in the beginning, we tried to collect more evidence. And like one way to collect more evidence was to send out a survey to all of these users saying, hey, you know, like what exactly, how do you imagine these single sessions? What you want to talk about? What are you willing to pay? How long should they be? And it was all great. It sounded all amazing. And we were like, yeah, okay, that also sounds good. Let's try it out and experiment it and actually offer it. So we offered this in a very light version. So just a Calendly link where they could schedule their first session and pay also via Calendly. We sent this out via email to all of these users and no one booked anything. Not a single person. So the experiment failed. And we were still not happy. We still said, like, we still believe in it, kind of. And said, even though it failed, maybe it was not viable enough. Maybe it was too shady to just send it out via email. And we even implemented it in our platform and put a button there and said, like, okay, if you click on this, you go to the single session and you come to the same sort of Calendly page. And only a single person booked the single session. So clearly, this is, like an experiment that failed. But imagine if we would have just said after the initial interviews, okay, let's implement this. This would have destroyed the entire business model. Mm-hmm. And it's just, you need to often also think in terms of experimentation or intelligent failure, also in terms of loss prevention. And in this case, it's just about absolutely de-risking like a decision that would have been completely wrong. And I think this is a good example of an intelligent failure.
Amazing. I generally love this framework. Maybe just quickly to summarize. The first type is basic failure. This happens to everyone multiple times in their careers. It's simply overseeing something, forgetting about something. The right initiatives to solve this are better rituals, better processes, or better checklists. Mm-hmm. The second type of failures are complex failures. These are hard to predict. This is, I think, one of the main tasks of a product manager to avoid them. Sometimes it cannot be avoided. And to prevent them, at least for the next time, making retrospectives and really analyzing what went wrong is the right thing to do. And then the third type of failure is actually a good failure. It's called the intelligent failure. And this is what we try to detect during experimentation. And do we understand correctly that we try to maximize intelligent failures so we can minimize complex failures?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, right? I think the complex failures are, when you do experimentation, you sort of are willingly engage into, hey, this might fail, right? But if it fails, we learn this. For complex failures, you don't really do this intentionally because you most likely don't see it until it actually happens. And then you need to try to identify what actually happened there. Because like what Amy Edmondson says in her book, it's that it's usually systems that cause this, right? Because like when you put the KPI example, right, you have like sort of a marketing system, a product system, and everything that sort of works together. And it's just like hard to foresee these mechanisms that work within each other. And so this is the only thing that I would differentiate a bit, yeah.
And what would be your number one tip to product managers to optimize for intelligent failures? I think experimenting is not always a great way of doing it, right? Doing the right experiments may be, but how do you get there? So how do you get to this point where you feel empowered as a product manager? Maybe you are in an organization where experimentation isn't the culture. Now you're listening to this and Nils just talked about all those interesting kinds of intelligent failures. What should they do tomorrow to actually get there, to get to these intelligent failures, to have an aha moment like you had when you had this Calendly link?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I think my number one tip would actually be to pay more attention or be more aware of what decision you need to make in your current situation, right? Because especially when you talk to leadership, I exchange a lot with C-level leadership and stuff like this. So, when I come around the corner and say like, hey, experimentation, sometimes it's always like, okay, wait, but only experimentation, or is this, do we really need to experiment? And in my opinion, it's a fair question because after all, experimentation is a method that we have. We can use this method, but we should be aware why we are using this method. And we're using this method usually for a high risk decision. If the decision is not high risk, and if you're in a certain funding situation, or if you don't have the capacity or whatever, it's totally fine to say, hey, let's use best practices that we saw other successful products use, right? But you should just be aware, hey, I'm making this decision with this amount of evidence because I assess this amount of risk. And I think this is ultimately in which direction every product manager should develop in, trying to put the right methods to the right decision. It's after all sort of a business science.
Amazing. And I think you just said one point that is also a great segue into the next section, which is talking to C-level about experimentation, which sometimes can be hard. Very often C-level wants to see initiatives being immediately executed. So Nils, what is your opinion, or what should a PM do? I think this is a situation that a lot of PMs were in already. When their boss approaches them with a big feature, they want you as a PM to be built. You as a PM want to do the right thing. You want to do some additional validation. Very often this can lead to bosses being annoyed that the initiative is not being started immediately. Any thoughts why this is, on the one hand, such a widespread topic? I think it's something that everyone has experienced already. And also any tips on how to deal with that?
Yeah, it's a super hard one. Like, I thought about this a lot because I also experienced it a lot, right? I think to handle the situation, to think about the situation, experience really helps in this context. To build confidence, to know what it means to evaluate or falsify a product or a feature. This really helps. And I mean, when you're saying why this is happening, I think ultimately power or leadership and things like this are just traditionally still rooted in I make the call, I make the decision. I think there is a shift currently happening that I also promote, because for me, leadership is not about this. I always say I don't think I'm smarter than the product managers that I manage, right? We're all very smart people, and it's rather about enabling them and making sure they have everything that they need. But as I said, in the leadership, this sometimes is still the case. Maybe not even the fault of the individual person that gives you this tasks or like has this opinion. Maybe it's pressure from outside, pressure even from partners or something like this. So I don't even judge people that there is a wrong leadership or whatever. It might actually be, like a system, a complex failure that leads us to this. But what to do against this? Like, I think like the most important aspect in all this is communication, right? So you need to really make clear, this is the way how I want to approach this, and this is exactly what we saw. And then have just regular exchanges on how the validation plan looks like, get in all the opinions of all the leaders, and then just try to communicate as transparently as possible what you saw, what you're currently thinking. And always also try to make sure that you as a product manager represent sort of the long-term perspective. Because, like if you get an opinion or if you get a request and this is in line with everything that you said before, with the strategy that you created a couple of months ago, then this is fine, right? This works, this is cool. But usually the things that we don't really like is when something slips in there. And we're like, oh yeah, the 1 month that we spent creating the strategy, forget about this. Like, we just do this now because for reason X, Y, Z. And this is what we don't like. And of course, then you also need to make sure what this means if we change the plan. If we change the plan, that means we can't build X, we can't build this, we can't build this. And also maybe from a strategic perspective, this means we position ourselves in a different way that we initially wanted to. And I think to communicate in this very clearly, and also communicating at the same time, hey, I'm happy to commit to this decision, but here are the trade-offs, right? This is, I think, the most important aspect to go against this. Yeah.
And what I've learned over the last years is, like, what helped me the most in situations like this is also empathy for the leader, trying to understand why they make this decision. So whenever I tried to put myself into their shoes, it was easier. And I think it took me until I had to lead people myself, had to lead PMs myself, and be in this situation for the first time myself, where I made a decision like that. And then afterwards I was like, why did I just do that? Why did I just push this onto this person? It would have been everything I hated for the last couple of years. And now I just did exactly that. I pushed something onto them because of a lot of, I don't know, there could be many reasons, external factors, a conversation I had with the CEO before, something like this, right? So many things that could have pushed me to this point. But I think if I could have then gone back in time, I think it would have helped me a lot in many situations to just try to understand where is this person coming from? Why are they pushing this decision right now? Because then I can also try to find arguments to actually push them maybe into another path that leads to maybe where they feel comfortable.
100%.
A question to maybe both of you. Do you think that also sometimes the leader is pushing for it because it's so deeply ingrained in their culture and it's hard to persuade them otherwise? Or is it always a matter of trust that you just need to build?
It's harder, I'd say, right? I think the thing that Stefan just said completely resonates with me. This is always the thing that sort of all these crazy fancy leadership decisions. If you just try to put yourself into shoes of other people, this is also what I always say. If product managers need to give like a major presentation, for example, like think about like what do they think when they come to this meeting? How do they feel? How should they feel afterwards? Like this classic sort of like framework, right? And yeah, I think it is super hard to say if this is just something that is like just something that they feel like for whatever reason. Or as I said, like if there are external works that just push them towards a certain direction, super hard to evaluate. But also here, I mean, there's nothing that speaks against to ask them, like maybe to, you know, like if it's really not understandable, like, hey, you know, I didn't fully get it, like super happy to carry this forward, but I would like to better understand to also provide a better solution for it. Nothing speaks against it. I think people would actually appreciate this. You know, like as Stefan, I was also in the situation that I had to commit to certain things where I would also question myself a bit. But this happens to all of us, right? And I appreciate people that then ask for the why. Yeah.
And I believe then from a point of like as a leader, right? I think that in my career there have been PMs that have pushed back very harshly on things that I did. And then there have been PMs that just accepted things and just carried on and built whatever I told them to build. I've always admired the PMs in my teams that pushed back and that have actually stood up and said, no, we can't do that. This is a terrible idea. We need to first look at A, B, C, and D. And I think many of them are at a point where they say, okay, if we then arrive at the point where, no, we need to build what you say we build, okay, we're fine. We can build this. It's not a problem. But them voicing it, I've never in my career once taken it like badly on them. And I think there's probably no product leader that does that. I think it's a very irrational fear that you have in maybe also in the beginning of your career, that pushing back on your boss could be bad for yourself. But I think most people I know and how their careers went, people that were pushing back more and that were voicing their opinions more had very, very good careers. So I think it's in the end, it's a great skill to have, to not just agree on things and do things as you're told, but actually stand up for what you believe is right. They need to hit some targets. They need to hit numbers. They need to do all these things. And then if you can show them a way to actually do these things better, hit better targets, I don't know, acquire more users, better retention, more revenue, whatever it may be that you are optimizing for, they will probably listen.
100%. I think the biggest fear that PMs have is that they come across as hard to work with. And I think that's also to a degree a valid point. And Nils, I think you said in the beginning, communication is key here. I think you still, when you do that, when you push back, still how you get this across matters.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I also always, you know, what I always encourage PMs to do is always to sort of announce what they're doing. So for example, to say something like, I need to push back here a bit, to voice this before you do it, because to just clearly state your intention, because that's such a basic thing, but we should never assume the worst of people. We should always assume good things. Like no one wants to create a toxic work environment or, you know, create a bad situation. We all just want to have a nice situation. We all want to be successful. It's just a matter of getting the communication and the intention out there. And this is one thing that I learned, which is also quite helpful sometimes. Tiny thing.
Amazing. Such a practical tip that I think everyone can take away and apply almost immediately. Nils, it has been a pleasure. There were so many stories. Also, what was extremely interesting for me is that you shared so many personal experience that you had with different types of failures. Yeah, this was it for Hotfix. For everyone who was listening, please subscribe and see you next time.